Hey, I'm Anna.
And I'm Shannon, and you're listening to The Assignment.
We've been friends for over a decade and have always enjoyed entertaining each other with our own rather personal stories.
Some hilarious, some embarrassing, some mundane, and some heartbreaking. But always as honest as possible.
I think we afford each other a soft place to land, without judgment and a whole lot of levity.
In this episode, we explore the world of news media and how our relationship to it colors the way we see the world. As world events continue to spiral at an increasingly rapid rate, people's mental health and its relationship to how closely they are paying attention to the news has come to the forefront of our consciousness as a society. Exploring our relationship with what we pay attention to is now a critical part with how we move through the world.
It's worth noting that this episode was recorded over a 2-month period of time between December 2024 and January 2025. Please be advised that this podcast deals with mature topics and is intended for an adult audience. Additionally, we sometimes discuss graphic and disturbing content, which may prove distressing for some listeners, in addition to your hosts.
Definitely your hosts.
So, news. We approach this topic from either end of the spectrum. I've always been intrigued by your appetite for and retention of information, specifically history and current events, and not in the sense that you regurgitate what you hear, but that you instead thoughtfully put it all together into a nice cohesive package and opinion with the ability to articulate your stance.
Well, thank you, Anna. I appreciate your level of empathy towards the humans that are the subject matter for the news and your ability to see both sides of topics in a fair and balanced way. You know, I also respect the fact that you set boundaries and determine not to pay attention if it impacts you negatively. Why you shy away makes sense. We are overloaded with information that can at times be destabilizing. But sometimes we need to realize that we have choices on what we give our attention to. So let's start with the first question that we want to explore, which were, what are your first memories or thoughts about the news?
Well, for me, despite the fact that I grew up during the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Challenger explosion, and the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, all amidst the rise of tech and TV and video, I may as well have grown up on another planet.
That's how I picture it.
Yeah. I was sheltered, and I don't think intentionally so. I mean, I have these memories of what we called girl in the street interviews, my parents' impromptu audio recordings destined to be played by my grandparents in Ontario, where my preschool age self was asked my opinion on a multitude of topics I knew nothing about, including news stories of the day. You know, Anna, how are you feeling about the current conflict in Peru? Unwell. I don't know.
Like, is this your dad with a camcorder?
Oh, well, we didn't have a camcorder. No, this was a just an audio recorder, like a tape. An audio tape with a microphone. And I'd be walking around the house with this little, playing grocery store or something with a little pretend cart. And they'd stop and ask me some random question.
This would all parents,
be. I know. But I was permitted to just be a kid. And I guess I appreciate that as being a very lucky reality, looking back on it. And most of my memories of my preteen years are really of simplistic things. Riding bikes, writing stories, playing outside with my sisters on our DIY bandstand, and lip syncing to Paula Abdul and Cyndi Lauper. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Drawing a keyboard on a 2x4 and anyway, and a whole lot of reading of fiction obsessively. I do think, though, my first thoughts about the news were more about the personalities that I saw on TV. I remember local newscasters much like they were, friends of my parents or family that I rarely or ever saw outside of photographs. You had Live at 5 with Steve Murphy and the CBC News at 6 with Jim Nunn. They delivered small-town special interest stories right alongside global news headlines like your compassionate great uncle, cognizant of not upsetting the children.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Growing up in the 80s and 90s in rural Nova Scotia, I had 3 television stations and a 60-minute daily TV allowance. It was usually MASH.
Of course.
Of course.
We also watched MASH.
Did you?
I still know the song.
Sing it?
Maybe later.
I think I was actually a teenager before we had a VCR in the house. And even then, I relied on my pappy, my grandfather from Toronto, to mail pre-recorded Much Music tapes or shows on cable TV that we didn't have. We had a small community newspaper called The Spectator, and you could read about, I don't know, what would be the family names in that area. Maybe Mrs. Burney visiting the home of Mrs. Longmire, I guess, in Victoria Beach, and the macaroons that they dined on, and who else visited. It was kind of a riot.
My God.
I actually did a cooperative education stint at that little newsroom, and I use that term loosely. It was located in a small complex next to MacArthur's Law Office and the laundromat. And I think
the
big time, yeah. I was in the 10th or 11th grade, and I wrote a story about my friends, the skateboarders, and the vibrancy and culture that they had brought to the local community. Pretty epic reporting.
I'm sure it was very vibrant.
It was. So my first memories of news make me think of community first and foremost, and second, of something meant only for adults. An indulgence of little to no consequence in the lives of children. Much like hearing the theme song to Dallas and knowing that meant bedtime, the news was just part of the background. Can you sing that theme song?
Hell yeah, I can sing that. I can sing all of them. I was raised by a television.
Right. Well, and we really were the last generation to remember a time before technology was in our hands as it is now. And we kind of got to watch that shift from analog to digital. News from friends or family came by letter or a phone call to a landline. And I don't know if I've told you this, but we had what was known as a party line, Shannon. Do you know what that is?
I'm still entertained by this is insane.
So it's a single phone line that's shared by multiple households. So we would have 2 long rings, and that reached our house. And then the Wilkins boys, who lived about a mile and a half down the dirt road I lived on in 1886, they were 2 short rings. And you would hear a really audible click if someone were to pick up while you were on the phone and eavesdrop on your conversation.
So you could, though, pick up, like if you heard the rings that weren't for your house,
right,
you could conceivably pick up and just listen to other people's conversations.
Not just conceivably, you did.
So did people do that?
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
That's what I mean. You would hear the click, you'd be like, oh, they're listening.
See, you didn't need newspapers if you had a party line.
That's right. I do feel, though, despite, eavesdropping and party lines, that news was consumed slowly and with intent, not haphazardly and coming at you from all angles, devices, and platforms like it does now, from people and institutions that you trusted until maybe you didn't. Maybe I'm romanticizing it a bit, but news from the outside world came by print, brows furrowed over a morning coffee, or by radio waves while staring contemplatively out the window at a world that still felt very far away. Our television channels went off the air at the end of the day with the national anthem sign-off and similar sign-on the following morning, and I would wait impatiently for programming to start again in the morning so that I could watch Astro Boy or the Land of Oz before school.
I also remember that theme song.
Astro Boy,
Astro Boy.
Oh, I thought you meant where the streets were paved with gold and no one ever gets old. That silly old Land of Oz. Anyway, weekend programming included cartoons, but also the highly unwatchable likes of Jimmy Swaggart, Mass for Shut-ins, and 100 Huntley Street.
Mass for Shut-ins.
Mass for Shut-ins. So appropriate. I digress. Like our parents before us said of their time, I feel our time also felt simpler.
So interesting. Because we've grown up in the same country, but in totally different worlds.
So what about you? What are your first memories or thoughts about the news?
What I can remember was 2 big news stories. The first 2 news stories that I remember from being a child that I started to sort of become aware of outside of the confines of my childhood bubble. So it was the mid-'80s, and there was a famine in Ethiopia. And then the other one was that the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, effectively ending communism. So I didn't understand the significance of either of these things. I remember, with respect to the famine, I remember seeing news footage of long lines of Black babies, stomachs distended. Their heads seemed impossibly large next to their starving bodies, flies buzzing around their heads, mothers holding their children wrapped up in scarves, those images. And it was hard for me to comprehend that somebody would let a child starve. I remember thinking that as a child myself at the time. I was like, how could they let that happen? How could anybody let something like that happen to a child? And then, of course, We Are the World and Do They Know It's Christmas Time and all of these big concerts and these big fundraising initiatives. And I remember feeling that the whole world was pulling together to correct this glaring error. I don't know why I had it in my head that only the kids were without food, like the adults had taken it from them. Sorry, we're bigger. We need more. It probably says more about how this particular thing was being sensationalized. So I wouldn't have understood that. The famine took place between 1983 and 1985. So that's the years that I was between 3 and 5 years old. But beyond reporting the news, it felt like the whole world was being guilt-tripped, like a collective of people sort of having their noses rubbed in this horrific thing that was happening. Look at what we've done. And so for years afterwards, I remember seeing commercials showing the same images to help raise money to send to these starving children in other countries. Everybody's seen these commercials. Some somber narrator's voice feigning heartbreak saying, for as little as 16 cents a day, you could save little so-and-so's life. And then you cut to the child that, he was standing on a hard, cracked earth before and all skinny. And then in the next scene, he's got a shirt suddenly and he's running on grass. And eventually you unsee them, right? You understand that you're being manipulated, so you become cynical so young. I remember being cynical about those commercials at a very early age. And it's estimated that somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million people died in that famine, which took place, as I said, between 83 and 85. The Live Aid organization, they raised an estimated 145 million British pounds, which is an absolutely astonishing amount of money. But if you think about the sensationalization of that issue, that is what they were using to raise money, right? They were selling the famine as opposed to reporting on the famine, if that makes sense. So selling tragedy has become something that, people say, never waste a crisis, I guess. So the second big story was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that was only, if you think about it, 1989, 35 years ago, which in historical terms is nothing. And at the time, I had no idea what was happening. I watched with interest at all of these people standing on a large concrete wall for days.
What is going on?
Busting loose these big concrete blocks one by one. There was huge crowds of them. And to me, it looked like, honestly, so much fun. Without historical context, all I could see was a bunch of people doing something that people don't normally do. They seemed happy and relieved. A collective decision was made that this wall simply would not do, and they were going to remove it. And so that was kind of my first introduction to collective action, and that was exhilarating. I understood that there were two parties. There was the people in power, and the people. The larger group of people was the power of the people who outnumbered the people in power. And if they decided they didn't want something anymore, they had the power to change it. All it takes is one big collective decision. And even without understanding what communism was, I understood what hope was. You could see it in the jubilation of the people standing on that wall. Right. So no manipulation necessary there. And interestingly, the fall of the Berlin Wall was in part because of a bureaucratic error. And I don't know if you knew this, but in 1989, there was a press conference given, and they were announcing that they were loosening travel restrictions between East and West Germany. And somebody handed the guy who was giving the press conference a note. I forget who he was, some politician. And it said, yes, we're loosening restrictions and we're allowing people from East Germany to emigrate permanently to West Germany. And the press conference, the people in the news media, Tom Brokaw was there, they were all there, and they said, what? What do you mean? And they started blasting it to every news station all over the world. And all of these people in East Germany were like, shit. And they just showed up to the checkpoints. And typically, in all of the years of that, they were separated before, if you crossed that border between East and West Germany, it was called in between the two places, the death strip. They would shoot you on sight. But the soldiers on the border were like, well, we're not going to do that because we've been told that it's okay. And that is why they all showed up. And on the other side of the wall, the people from West Germany gathered, and they had flowers and they had champagne and they were greeting their East German friends. And the media played an absolutely critical role in facilitating, a huge moment in history, which is fascinating. As a child, I didn't know that. As a child, I was consuming all of this on television. I didn't have any history behind me. It was all images, There's nothing like that for a kid. Without them, I might have stayed longer in my childhood bubble without the pictures, right? So reading a newspaper would have made no sense. When I think about kids today and I think about the fact that they live on screens, especially YouTube, but the internet in general, I think about all of the images crowding their brains without context. No context, no wonder they're all so depressed. Kids live in idealized worlds, and on top of that, they are sponges, so indoctrination is easy on a kid. So how we introduce the world to a child's brain matters. It's also of interest to me that when I wrote my impressions about these two news stories, I did zero research. I literally wrote from memory of exactly what I remembered about those times. And when I went back to do the research, it was remarkably close to what had actually happened. So 40 years had passed, and I've forgotten way more news stories in the intervening years, but I still remember those two stories. So then you think about a kid now and what they are consuming of news and how they're consuming it. It gives you pause, We need to understand that news can shape young children's brains in ways that might never be able to be undone. Yeah.
It would be interesting to ask this question of a young person.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, what do you think about, what's your news story that you're really interested in that's going on today? I wonder what they'd say. So how about you, Anna? What would you say were your first areas of sincere interest in current events growing up?
Oh, I remember this one really clearly. I was probably maybe 10 or 11 years old, maybe a little older, maybe 12. And there was a story in the news at that time that really grabbed my attention. It was about a man named Alan Legier. And I grew up in Nova Scotia. He was multiple things. He was a serial killer, rapist, and an arsonist. And he was on the run. And he was on the run less than a morning's drive away from my idyllic little hometown. And for my little 12-year-old self, that was far too close for comfort.
No kidding.
So I don't know if you heard about Alan Legier. They called him the monster of the Miramichi. And if you're not familiar with the case, he went to jail in 1986. What had started out as a convenience store robbery evolved into a rape and homicide, I believe with 2 others involved, and they had all gone to prison. So a few years later, he's en route to a routine doctor's appointment. convinces guards to allow him a washroom break. And while he's in the restroom at the hospital, he picks the locks of his full body shackles with a piece of metal they had hidden inside a cigar. Oh, no.
Full Hannibal Lecter.
Right.
Wild.
So then he manages to get the attention of the guard who's standing outside and has him open the door. And as the guard opens the door, Legier brandishes a metal shiv that he had fashioned from a TV antenna, and he had it concealed in his rectum. And with this metal shiv, takes the hospital attendant Peggy as his hostage. He managed to escape and then began a 7-month killing spree. Worth noting that he did let Peggy go.
Huh.
Yeah. So
Sure, Peggy was never the same.
I'm sure she was not. So 1989, repeated sightings, robberies, local residents are on edge. He resurfaced in late May and at that time attacked an elderly shopkeeper and her sister-in-law. He murdered one of them and the other he savagely beat and raped before setting her house on fire. So thankfully, the surviving woman was rescued before the house burned down. However, it doesn't end there. So, latter part of 89, he stayed on the run, eluding capture and leaving those of us living in the maritime provinces at large laser focused on this case. So, although he had laid relatively low during the summer months, he struck again in mid-October, and he raped and murdered the Daphne sisters. A couple of weeks later, he was suspected of stealing 2 rifles from a lockbox of a truck that was parked at a nearby motel. So at this time, you have composite sketches plastered all over the media, and rewards were offered for information of any kind. Parents were afraid to let their children out alone to play, and Halloween trick-or-treating was effectively canceled in Miramichi that year.
Stupid Alan Legier.
Stupid Alan Legier. So I was convinced that my idyllic, isolated little home in the woods was the perfect hideout for this escaped convict. And actually, I think my bedroom was on the lower level of the home at that point in time. And that made it even extra scary for me because it wasn't like there wasn't an extra layer of another floor between somebody getting into the house.
I don't feel like the floor would have prevented Alan Legier.
I feel like I would have heard him. I would have had more time to escape, you know? I probably ran through that a few times in my head. Anyway. So I really began to look at the world a little differently than I had before. And I certainly looked at the woods surrounding my home differently than I had before. So instead of it being this safe haven for me, I worried it would be a safe haven for a deranged homicidal killer.
Right. Yeah.
So still 1989, another month passes, and it is what is believed to be Legier's last murder. And the site is the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church in Chatham Head, New Brunswick, where he loots the church, beats the reverend to death, and then steals his car. So Legier was responsible for numerous carjackings, hostage takings, and robberies before his eventual capture in November of 1989. He's still alive, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah, he was denied parole in 2021. Thankfully. But yeah, Alan Legier. So he was my first real experience in which I grasped the connection between the larger world outside of my safe little bubble, growing up here in rural Nova Scotia, and the first real understanding that the bad things that you hear about in the nightly news really aren't a world away. And I guess it was my first real interest in a news story that I can recollect, and at least the first to elicit a real tangible response. And I'm guessing also what probably spawned a real interest in true crime as I got older.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. What about you? What were your first real areas of interest?
Well, interestingly enough, there was a little bit of a personal connection to this story. So I grew up in Toronto, and I went to summer camp with a girl named Meredith Lemon. And I remember the summer around when we were probably 10 or 11 years old. We were up on our bunks in our cabin, you know, on a typical night telling scary stories. We were obsessed with that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if kids are obsessed today as we were back in the 80s, but, you know, in the 80s you had Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger, Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees, you know, all of these characters, disaffected men who were bullied in their youth and grew into monsters bent on revenge. Sound familiar?
It does.
You know, we were unaware watching those movies with how closely those fictional stories resembled the profile of actual real life serial killers.
Yeah.
Meredith lived in Scarborough, and at the time, her neighborhood was being stalked by a monster that the newspapers were calling the Scarborough Rapist. So Meredith knew somebody who had, I think, caught a man staring through their window or had followed them home and then stared through their window. And that's how he started. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, the Scarborough Rapist came out to be Paul Bernardo. And Paul Bernardo and his psychopathic wife, Karla Homolka, by the time we were 13 or 14 years old, it came out that they had murdered 2 girls around my age. One's name was Kristen French and the other Leslie Mahaffey, as well as Karla's baby sister, Tammy. And I have vivid memories of learning at that age, how those bodies were found. Kristen found naked, face down in a ditch near Burlington, all of her hair cut off. Leslie was dismembered, encased in concrete blocks, and sunk into a local lake, identified through her braces. There's school photos, which were shown on the news nonstop, are tattooed into my brain forever. I can still close my eyes and clearly see both of their faces. You could kind of surmise from the reporting bits and pieces of those 2 girls' personalities. Kristen was sort of a good girl, responsible girl. Leslie was kind of more of a wild child. She ran with a wilder crowd. Both of them were killed in the most horrifying fashion imaginable. And there was something so unfair about that. I couldn't kind of wrap my head around why them? They were just like me. They lived not far from me. They were my age. Why did they have to have their lives cut short by this weird couple? And the other weird thing that was sort of hard to understand when I was that age is that they were also famous. They were famous in their victimhood. And famous in a way that I sort of coveted in a weird way. And the whole thing was confusing. The sensationalism of it, it was enticing as it was disturbing. And I remember at camp the summer that it had all come out and they were on trial. Our cabin was on a canoe trip, and we stayed awake late one night and determined to have a seance to commune with the spirits of Kristen and Leslie. And I remember our counselor caught us and scolded us for our insensitivity on the matter, which she was right. But violence is entertainment, right? That was kind of my gateway drug, like you said, to true crime. Mm-hmm. The strange, unspoken fascination with murder that has birthed that entire industry. In order for it to have that special hook, it kind of necessarily needs to be true. So there needs to be real monsters in the world to get that fear response that doubles as exhilaration. And I was not really taught to think about these things responsibly. I was really not taught how to think about them at all. And I mean, when we think about who teaches us to look at the world, the first teachers that we have are our parents. So what about your parents in terms of how did their maybe political leanings inform your own consumption of news media and interpretation of the world?
Well, I grew up in a liberal household, for certain. And I knew very little of politics growing up, though. Instead, probably ideals and principles and values. I was encouraged to be critical, but open-minded to different opinions, to be curious and tolerant. I was taught to value and engage in creative pursuits and to pursue being happy and kind. I was encouraged to question all manner of things, and that privilege came without any significant social ramifications, because the idea of respectful debate and sharing ideas was a noble and insightful pursuit. I do think this influence often encouraged me to root for the underdog and to look for good things before bad in people and their opinions. Paradoxically, though, I think it may have also bred this kind of inclination towards feeling a little morally superior with my admittedly narrow definition of open-mindedness. And maybe, some looking through some progressive rose-colored glasses. I think my parents would probably have wished to be part of maybe what Jack Layton's Canada might have looked like. Not necessarily because of the party he represented, but I'm reminded of his quote. My friends, love is better than anger, hope is better than fear, optimism is better than despair. So let us be loving, hopeful, and optimistic, and we'll change the world. And that to me represents the lens through which I believe my parents always viewed the world, and the lens through which I think they hoped that I would view the world as I got older. And certainly I've wrestled with some of those beliefs I held when I was younger, and I sometimes feel like the goalposts have shifted a little bit there, and maybe there's a new underdog in town and that they have a legitimate voice too.
Mm.
Yeah. And I mean, now the thought of voicing and discussing some honest questions and thoughts on polarizing topics makes me really, really uncomfortable because there are ramifications. It's as though we've crossed a line in the sand, and even entertaining conversations on certain subject matter warrants your immediate cancellation in certain circles.
Right.
It's like you need a safe place to have any conversation.
Yeah. We should all have like a card we give each other. Like, here's my stance on the following topics. Can we be friends?
Can we be friends? I'm open to admitting I'm wrong. You know, it's
Won't
fine.
you be my neighbor?
What's that from?
Mr. Rogers.
Oh, okay. Again, 3 channels, 1 hour TV. I missed that. So perhaps I was sheltered, perhaps naive, but I really believe there was a time not so long ago that divide wasn't so great between people and these tightly held beliefs, that we could listen to each other with respect and an openness to understanding where each other are coming from. But then again, maybe I'm wrong, and I was just really lucky to have people in my life who could agree to disagree, or were, strong enough people to change their mind if the situation warranted it. I don't know.
I think that, one of the things that we're going to go into talking about later is that our rage is a manufactured product of the way that current news works. But back then, there was still a little bit more of a objectivity
right.
in the institution of journalism. And there was perhaps more journalistic principles at play. And so I think that allows more of a balanced discourse than we have now.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the problems that we're in. That's part of the mess.
Well, it is a mess.
Yeah, it sure fucking is.
So I'm going to throw the question back to you. How do you think your parents' political leanings or feelings impacted you growing up?
I mean, this was an interesting question to think about because I hadn't thought about how it had influenced me necessarily. During my teenage years, I was woken up every morning extremely early by the smell of very, very strong coffee. Very good coffee, but very strong coffee. And it kind of wafted up the back kitchen stairs all the way to the 3rd floor where my brother and I had our bedrooms. I could hear the groaning of a coffee maker and the rustling of the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star as my parents sat at the kitchen table downstairs and read through their own respective newspapers. You could hear them sort of exchanging the odd comment in hushed tones, trying not to wake anybody. And I would get up and race from my bed to go join them downstairs. I loved this. I loved the early morning routine. In fact, to this day, and I talk about it all the time, my early morning routine, I get up, I race downstairs to read the news, to drink extremely strong coffee, and just to have that moment of quiet, unfettered news consumption. And one of the great things about this routine back then was that I got to hear my parents' perspective of the events of the day. And my parents are not like any other parents that I know. They did not sugarcoat their opinions. They did not try to take a measured or balanced approach in their understanding of complex issues. Their first take was often the only take, and it was delivered without any bullshit, and especially in my stepfather's case, with plenty of expletives. My mother read the Toronto Star and was mostly interested in local scandals.
I can appreciate that.
Especially if she had some sort of personal connection to it. You know, she knew a guy that was connected to the story. And she was also a teacher and spent her life as a union member because of that. And I remember her stopping some conservative premier of Ontario at the entrance to a school play that she was directing and asking him for a donation as he'd cut public school art programs and then stared him down as he awkwardly fished around his pockets for a spare toonie as the crowd formed around him. I believe that was Mike Harris. God love her. My stepfather, finance guy, read the, business section, obviously, and I really appreciated his takes on this because he obviously was an expert. When it came to politics, though, he was almost unifyingly irritated. Unless the politician came from a business background, true to his nature and that of what I can see most private sector businessmen, he hates bureaucracy and he hates bureaucrats. The inefficiency of government, taxes, Like most upper middle class people in Toronto, they were and are staunch liberals. Even in the current Trudeau era, they would still hold their noses and vote for him. I know they would. The idea of supporting any other political party would be ludicrous. So being liberal, I guess, is sort of baked into the mindset of most of the people I grew up with, to be honest. They don't want to give all the money away to, the quote unquote ne'er-do-wells in social programs like the NDP, who've never successfully run a government in their thinking, but believe definitely strongly in some social safety nets, and especially universal healthcare. And in my adult life, I have voted for all three major political Canadian parties, but my votes always seem to be a protest vote, a reactionary vote.
Yeah, I get that.
To the current events of the day. It's also kind of a reaction to the solid foundation of my parents' political leanings. It is them and that foundation that forms my own political foundation, the sense of understanding that I return to and rail against as I try to form my own opinions. And I never thought about myself as a swing voter, but I guess that's exactly what I am. I still often talk politics with my parents as longtime snowbirds who were, in Florida, I think, for over 20 years. I think them and many Canadians down in the U.S. With close American friends found the support of Donald Trump surprising, to say the least. I think they watched pretty perplexed as the world changed in front of their eyes down there. And eventually during the pandemic, they sold their place and they got out. The whole glory, guns, and God thing was definitely not their jam. Not even for warm weather and year-round golf. I always respected that they knew where their line was and where to draw it. And I guess that foundation is important now more than ever on not allowing yourself to kind of get carried away. Although it hasn't stopped me from getting carried away, Anna.
You carried away?
Not at all.
No. So this next question, disseminating fact from fiction, was one that I really designed for Shannon because it's something I struggle with. So critical thinking amidst a sea of information. How do you make sense of it all?
I love this question. Although it's embarrassing to admit, I am somewhat of a gullible person. If somebody is telling me something, whether that be on the news or at a podcast or face-to-face, I tend to take it as fact, which has led me down a lot of rabbit holes, where when I arrive at the bottom of said rabbit hole and something stinks, suddenly the veil is lifted from my eyes and I've realized that it was either misinformation, an intentional hoax, or propaganda. And I fucking hate it when this happens. Sorry. I know I am responsible for what I believe and I shouldn't blame the source, but I do. I feel they have conned me like some 2-bit magician. My brain likes to believe in conspiracy because of the component of mystery, you know? It's an earnest desire, like believing in Santa Claus. Yeah. When I finally learned the truth about the fake magic of Christmas, the world was suddenly a very dull and boring place. And I wanted to get it back. As a human being, we make sense of the world by storytelling. If you think about thousands of years back in time, they told stories of gods and goddesses that were merely stand-ins for natural weather events, right? Natural processes were made supernatural so that the human brain could enact some sort of understanding and or control over what was happening to them and to their crops. So, you know, you have the mantle of weather gods of the early time, Ra, the Egyptian god of the sun, Thor, the Norse god of thunder, the Greek god Zeus, you know, all of these stories to explain phenomena that at the time, without science and context, in the minds of those people, they were very much real beings, and the effects of their emotions, primarily anger, had on the people that worshiped them, right? So if we take, for example, the sun god, Ra, the Egyptian god, he's featured with having the head of a peregrine falcon, which on top of that, there's a large sun disk, and affixed on top of that, it's sort of wrapped in a cobra.
This is very elaborate.
It's a pretty sweet hat. And so every day, Ra gets up, drags the sun across the sky, and then at night, he's got to jump on a boat, venture through the underworld, put on a ram hat, you know, which again, with the hats, Egypt, and each night battle Apophis, the god of chaos, who's featured as a gigantic serpent, in order for the sun to rise again the next morning. So imagine the precariousness of this in the minds of the people of that time. You know, imagine going to sleep every night with the thought, I hope Ra wins. The sun rises tomorrow. I mean, no wonder they worshipped, right? All while this, you know, sounds ridiculous to the modern mind, which relies on a more scientific understanding of the natural processes that govern our world. If we're really honest with ourselves, is our current time any less precarious? And do we really understand as much as we think we do? I say no. I shout no from the goddamn rooftops. Not to go on a rant, but I'm so sick of people saying, do your own research. I think people have a unique discomfort with the reality that we just don't fucking know, right? Someone with a PhD in physics should come on this podcast and explain to our listeners that time and space is an illusion, apparently, as is matter. All right? So sorry, folks. And my kitchen table is part of a hologram that I am imagining. Fuck it. I'm going to believe in Ra.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
Go Ra.
Yeah. I digress. So, you know, it might seem frivolous, but, you know, to understand my gateway to how I disseminate fact from fiction in the news came from an addiction that I had in my teens and 20s to celebrity gossip. The weekly tabloids, People Magazine, Us Weekly. I was glued to that shit back then. You know, this was a storied time before social media made everyone essentially their own small-time celebrity, and the world became so fucked up that everyone lost interest in the lives of the rich and famous. If you can't afford groceries, you don't care what George Clooney's doing this week. That's just how it goes. So that world, though, has much to teach the modern day news watcher on how to smell bullshit in a news story. Celebrities are or were protected by teams of publicists and are extremely adept when it comes to allowing information that benefits them to flow into the public sphere. Well, they often feign being sort of put out by all the attention. In fact, the attention not only benefits them, they are usually behind that attention entirely. Paparazzi shots are prearranged. Information is specifically leaked to certain sources, and they're told that they're allowed to share it with certain news outlets that are kind to those celebrities, when it aligns with their image and the narrative they want told. So stories are sort of crafted with great care by teams of people in the background. And those relationships with media outlets that remain hidden are often transactional and mutually beneficial.
Sort of like the early days of building their brand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is exactly it. So a great example of this, I would say, is the British monarchy, whose relationship with, the insatiable British tabloids is, I would say, a shameful example of using that transactional relationship to bully their enemies and elevate their quote unquote principles. Sorry, Meghan Markle. You could have been a contender, Meghan Markle. What this side of the news teaches us is that the source matters, and the relationships that source has within the sphere of news media matters. And it doesn't just extend to people who are willing to be interviewed or have news stories done about them when they are cooperative. It extends to who owns the news, right? That's becoming more and more apparent as the years go on, who their advertisers are, and most importantly, who their multinational corporate overlords are. The modern day Western oligarchs prefer to remain nameless and faceless, but I think it's like 6 people that own 90% of modern media properties, brands, movie studios, television networks, newspapers, print media, and radio stations. 6 people. So to really understand what you are consuming and where bias lives, you need to understand how to follow money. And in the celebrity world, you see it in how much money a star can be relied on to make. And I would say some very problematic men have consistently escaped unscathed from public relations disasters because they are bankable. We see this in Tom Cruise. We see it in Brad Pitt, Eddie Murphy. There's so many examples of bankable stars that had unflattering news stories about them just simply buried.
Except for maybe Will Smith.
Yeah. Oh, Will Smith. You can't slap a guy at the Oscars, man.
What were you thinking?
Jesus Christ. Oh.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
Continue on.
When you take this lens into an understanding of news, you also need to factor in how a news outlet leans. So sure, their journalists might use journalistic principles to report on stories, but who tells them what stories to report? Who's writing headlines? Does the New York Times come out with a story that shows Donald Trump in a positive light? Fuck no. Their readers would revolt, right? But Fox News will. So, I wanted to take a little bit of a journey into news headlines, in particular after the Trump-Harris debate, which, in my own, I'm sure, biased opinion, Harris clearly and decisively won that debate. So very left, The Atlantic, the headline that came out after that debate was, what was he even talking about? Trump's rant about immigrants eating pets was another sign of his break with reality. That was my favorite part, especially the memes that came after.
Oh, the songs and the...
So New York Times, which, would be considered left-leaning, who won the debate? ? A sharp Harris rattled Trump. Reuters, which is probably the best, most center news publication. Harris puts Trump on defensive in combative debate. Right-leaning New York Post, Trump-Harris debate, the best and worst moments. And very right, our friends, Fox News. ABC debate moderators spark fury for aggressive fact-checking of Trump and easy treatment of Harris. See that? that's how you need to understand the news today. The source is everything. This is capitalism at its finest, and why not only is the source governed by its owners and their priorities, but it's governed by us, the almighty consumer. In a time of algorithms and news outlets crowding the fields of our attention by trying to spark engagement, they are placating directly to your leanings. They are feeding you what you want to hear, so you'll keep watching, listening, reading, etc. If you didn't get a rise out of consuming the news, you might go back to it less often. So it is a con, right? They are 2-bit magicians, but the magic is fear. And it is insatiable, and we can't look away.
Well, I can't.
Some of us can't. What about you, Anna? How do you disseminate fact from fiction?
I don't. No, really, I don't make sense of it at all. It's like I'm only able to entertain the most cursory of analysis of facts presented by differing perspectives. I get frustrated. I get so frustrated. I try to draw conclusions, but sometimes I find I'm almost too open-minded to all arguments and angles, and I just get mired in it. I struggle to determine what evidence and reasoning are valid, despite knowing that there isn't always a right answer.
Right.
You know, multiple things can be true. I think you say that frequently, and it makes me feel better.
Yeah.
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 It's like I'm already too far gone, Shannon. It's just to invest the time and energy into something that I don't get a rise of. It doesn't interest me.
Yeah.
I have to force myself into it. To invest the time and energy to do so, to truly understand the complexities, history, and trajectory of any topic, to even know where to begin to fact check. It just assumes that I'm savvy enough and critical enough to sift through the bullshit and the conspiracies and the manipulation and the bias. But moreover, that I have the desire to do so, which I do not.
Good for you.
Well, I don't know, because my ignorance really is embarrassing and inexcusable in a sense. But I also suspect I am not alone in this basic need to disconnect and simplify.
God, no.
No, and I mean, to truly protect my own sanity and ability to function in the world. And at the end of the day, you know, I'm concerned about the connections in my own little world and the challenges faced by the people I know. Sometimes those are big world problems, sometimes they aren't. And despite this making me, you know, sound fairly privileged, it's also important to be honest, I think. So to honor that approach, you know, I'm pretty insular. And unless the subject hits close to home or close to the home of someone I love, then admittedly, I have probably checked out and I'm not interested in getting to the heart of the issue. So, Shannon, I live a life of apologetic self-preservation. That is it.
I'm proud of you.
Thanks, Betty.
Yeah. I'm proud of you. I think that's a good place to live.
Well,
on the next episode of The Assignment, News Addiction or Aversion, we explore news as entertainment, what we got out of avoiding the news, and how growing up in a peaceful time has left us unprepared for meeting the chaos of our present moment.